I woke up that morning to the rumbling roar of bulldozers. The sound reverberated through my old farmhouse windows like a distant thunder, threatening my whole existence. At first I thought it was just some roadwork on the main street leading out of town. But as I pulled aside the threadbare curtain and peered out, I saw that the rumbling came from my own backyard. My heart froze and my breath caught in my chest. There, not more than 200 yards away, I saw half a dozen construction vehicles lined up along the very edge of my property. I had grown up on that land. My father had once told me there was no richer soil in all of upstate New York, no place more fertile for dreams to take root. The farmhouse itself was over a century old, built by my great-grandfather who had fled the city life for a quieter corner of the world. He had wanted a piece of land he could call his own, a place where each morning arrived with the choir of birds instead of the screech of sirens. I had cherished every single board and nail in that house. Each gave me the feeling of living within the history of my own bloodline. But that morning, the idyllic calm was shattered. I grabbed my jacket and strode outside, feeling the tall grass slap against my ankles. The humidity was thick. It was one of those August days when the sun could fry an egg on concrete by noon. As I drew nearer, a sickening realization grew in the pit of my stomach. These people were actually on my land. Worse still, large wooden stakes roped off a rectangular section of ground where my father's orchard used to stand. The orchard he had poured years of sweat into, only for me to preserve. Now, half of those apple trees were nothing but stumps and mulch. A cluster of workers in yellow vests huddled around a blueprint. I approached, my hands balled into fists. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded. It took all my willpower not to shout. The workers exchanged surprised glances before a tall man with a headset calmly waved his hand, signaling the machinery to pause. "You got a problem, sir?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. He held a clipboard with official-looking papers clipped on top. The corners of the pages were dog-eared, as though they'd been consulted 1,000 times. A bright logo that read HOA in bold letters was printed on the back. "This is private property," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You have no right to bulldoze anything here. Stop your work and clear out. I haven't signed a single document granting any of you permission to do this." He gave me that plastic smile people use when they're about to run you over with legal jargon. "We have authorization," he replied. "Our boss filed all the necessary paperwork weeks ago, sir. You can take it up with the Homeowners Association, or better yet, with Ms. HOA herself." I'd heard that name in hush-hush whispers around town. Miss HOA, the formidable head of our local homeowners association, who seemed to have the council in her pocket. She was rumored to have deep connections with certain powerful real estate developers. There were even whispers that she had a few local officials on her payroll. But hearing her name in connection with my land made my pulse pound so hard I thought my arteries would burst. I demanded to see the documents and the man obliged. He brandished an official-looking permit from the municipal office. Apparently, with the approval of the HOA, they were set to transform a unused field into a profitable complex of shops and mini restaurants. The nerve of them, labeling my father's orchard as unused field, as though the memories of my childhood had been condensed into a 2-word description. My blood simmered, but I kept a tight rein on my voice. Years of experience had taught me that losing your temper too soon was a surefire way to get dismissed as emotional or irrational. "Where's Miss HOA?" I asked, my tone sharp. The bright morning sky seemed too cheerful for a scene of such blatant trespassing. "I'd like to speak to her directly." "Down at the main trailer, about half a mile that way," he said, pointing toward a strip of gravel road that cut across the back of my orchard. "But you're gonna have to wait. She's in meetings with the foreman and some city inspectors." City inspectors, I thought. So that's how deep her pockets run. She had everything lined up, from the local building code officials to the town planners. I felt a wave of dread rolling through my gut. It seemed these people intended to steamroll me, literally and figuratively. The old orchard meant the world to me. It was the only slice of land that truly felt like home. My father's ashes were scattered beneath one of the largest apple trees there. Now that tree was gone, cut down and fed into a wood chipper. but one thing about me that Miss Hoa and her bulldozers couldn't have known. I'd never lost a fight over property or justice in my life. That orchard was my birthright. My father's dying wish was for me to protect it from greedy hands. I turned on my heel and marched back to the farmhouse, letting the hiss of the machinery behind me fuel my resolve. I had a plan, though no one there had any idea just how far I could go to make sure I'd win. Inside the creaky old house, I grabbed a glass of water, my mind racing. I cursed myself for not checking my mail more promptly. I'd been away for a few weeks, traveling between counties for business, and maybe important notices had piled up. But nothing could have justified such a blatant overreach. Without skipping a beat, I rummaged through the cluttered desk in the living room, searching for anything that might look like a letter or a summons. Sure enough, after tossing aside flyers for local pizza shops, I found a large envelope. Bold letters on the front read, "Homeowners, Association Notice of Proposed Development." The letter was dated 3 weeks ago, stamped with Miss Hoa's fancy gold embossed logo. My name was misspelled, and the address on the envelope had a smudge that looked suspiciously like the result of deliberate tampering. Could it be that they intentionally made it untraceable? The cynic in me certainly believed so. The letter basically stated that an administrative hearing had been scheduled concerning the proposed construction of a shopping plaza on Plot 145, currently unoccupied farmland. A wave of nausea hit me when I read the phrase, unoccupied farmland, as if no one lived here and as though the orchard and house were mere illusions. The letter insisted that if the land's ownership were contested, the proprietor had the right to appear and challenge the construction. The kicker: the hearing date was already a week past. In other words, I had missed my chance to protest. I stared down at that letter, my jaw clenched so tight I thought my molars would crack. This was clearly orchestrated. Miss Hoa's people must have known that the best way to bypass me was to ensure I never got the notice in time. For a moment, I felt heartbreak seep in. Would all my father's legacy be turned into a cluster of franchise fast food joints and tacky gift shops? Would that be my orchard's final fate? But a fire lit inside me. I wasn't just any landowner with no recourse, and Ms. Hoa would soon discover that messing with me would mean messing with the laws of this county, and the strictest judge to ever occupy the bench. Yes, in my day job, I was Judge Graham Anderson of Bloomfield County, known to hand down the heaviest sentences for corruption and fraudulent schemes. But that was a part of my life I'd purposely kept quiet in this small town where I'd chosen to keep my father's property. Over the years, I had presided in countless battles involving unscrupulous associations and shady developers. I'd seen them bribe lawyers, threaten local families, and lean on technicalities to get their way. I'd also seen the heartbreak on people's faces when they lost everything to corporate greed. So I had made it my mission on the bench to hold such entities accountable whenever they broke the law. Now, ironically, I was both judge and victim, only I had to be careful. If I rushed headlong into this wearing my judge's robe, Ms. Hoa and her cronies might turn it into a spectacle of conflict of interest, claiming I was wielding judicial power for personal gain. No, I needed to play this game just right, gather evidence, and dismantle their operation from the inside out. I wanted them to see me as nothing more than a naive landowner, a local nobody who was outmatched by the might of a well-connected developer. By the time they discovered who I really was, I intended for it to be far too late for them to wiggle free. My cell phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. It was my old friend Jesse Caldwell, who had grown up down the road. Jesse was a local environmental activist, always up in arms about protecting the wetlands near the orchard from pollution. "Graham, buddy, do you know they've started construction on your property? I just saw them chopping down the old orchard. Are you okay with this?" "Absolutely not," I shot back, glancing out the window again to see a forklift lowering a stack of concrete blocks. "I'm going to figure out who authorized this. They're claiming they got a rubber stamp from the city, but I never signed anything." Jesse cursed under his breath. "Listen, I'm organizing a small group of residents who are opposed to large-scale commercial developments in rural areas, especially in an area that might threaten the wetlands. If they pour asphalt over your orchard, runoff is going to flow directly into the wetlands behind your fields." His voice trembled with a mixture of anger and worry. I closed my eyes for a second, inhaling the stale air of the living room. "Thanks for letting me know," I said. "I appreciate the heads up. Keep me posted on any new findings. Meanwhile, I'll try to get an official word from Ms. Hoa." After hanging up, I stepped back outside, deciding I'd go meet her right then. The heavy heat pressed in like a suffocating blanket, but I welcomed the discomfort. It would keep me sharp, remind me that I was in a fight for something worth protecting. My boots crunched over the gravel of the makeshift road leading to a large white trailer. My orchard stumps lay like fallen soldiers on either side, the sweet smell of sawdust mingling with exhaust fumes. I felt a pang of loss. I remembered running through these rows as a kid, picking apples with my father every September. Now, it was reduced to this bleak wasteland. When I reached the trailer, I overheard muffled voices. Someone was talking about building permits and zoning codes. I knocked on the metal door, and a moment later it swung open. A woman in a crisp blazer stood before me. Short, calculated eyes, hair pinned back in a severe bun. Her features were sharp, her lips pressed tight with confidence. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her mid-30s, but had an air of command that surpassed her years. "You must be Ms. Hoa," I said, forcing a polite tone. "I need to speak with you about this property." She arched an eyebrow. "And who might you be, stepping into my office uninvited?" I handed her my card, which simply said Graham Anderson, owner, Orchard Estate. I'd made those cards for personal use, not indicating anything about my real profession. "I am the property owner, and I'm told your organization claims to have the right to build on my land." She pursed her lips and waved me inside. The trailer's interior was cramped, with large maps tacked on the walls, each depicting the orchard in subdivided grids. A scale model on the central table showed an artist's rendition of a sleek shopping plaza. I winced when I saw how thoroughly they'd planned every detail. "Well, Mr. Anderson," she began, "the Bloomfield Homeowners Association, which I chair, along with our business partner, Garrick and Lewis Developers, have been granted authority to build a new shopping center here. We followed every protocol. You were notified by certified mail. We had a hearing in the presence of city representatives. The plan was approved. And here we are." I met her stare, matching her confidence with quiet fury. "I never agreed to that. I received your letter only today, after the hearing date had already passed. Isn't that an unfortunate coincidence?" She shrugged, feigning sympathy. "I can't control the Postal Service, Mr. Anderson, but we abided by the law. If you failed to show up, that's hardly our responsibility." I clenched my fists at my side, exhaling slowly. I recognized the arrogance of someone who believed they'd won before the match even started. "Well, Ms. Hoa, I hope you're aware that forcibly entering my land and demolishing my orchard without my explicit consent could lead to a legal claim of trespass at the very least, if not fraud." Her smile remained intact, though a flicker of annoyance danced behind her eyes. "We have a signed document from the city approving the appropriation of what was believed to be unclaimed farmland within the municipal boundary. On top of that, we have evidence that your property taxes were significantly behind for the orchard portion, thus placing it under the city's claim. This has all been verified." She slid a paper across the table. Indeed, it was a notice from the county tax office referencing delinquent payments. My father had set up a separate deed for the orchard years ago, one that had a slightly different address. It appeared the tax bills for that orchard deed might have gone to an old P.O. box after he passed away. The sum owed was apparently trivial in the grand scheme, but it gave Ms. Hoa the foothold she needed to convince the city that my orchard was effectively forfeited. The city had the right to auction or reassign the property, which they did, she concluded, her tone triumphantly silky. And the Homeowners Association took the initiative. "We're building a beneficial development for the entire community. New jobs, local shops, good revenue for the city. Unless you can produce evidence to the contrary, I'm afraid we're proceeding as planned. I felt the blood drain from my face. If the orchard was on a separate deed that I'd overlooked, it was possible the taxes were never properly paid. But it wasn't because I refused to pay. It must have been an administrative error after my father's passing. Perhaps the county changed the address, or it got mixed in my father's estate paperwork. Regardless, the orchard was mine by inheritance. No signature of mine ever relinquished it. They had no right to claim it was unclaimed farmland, but from a strictly procedural standpoint, Ms. Hoa had played the system skillfully. "This is extortion," I hissed, barely able to contain the fury roiling within me. "And you're using shady legal loopholes to bulldoze someone's family land for your profit." Her posture stiffened. "Be careful with your words, Mr. Anderson. I run a respectable association working hand in hand with the city for the public good. If you have evidence this was done improperly, you should have come to the hearing, but since you were absent, we were granted the rights. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the foreman." With that, she turned on her heel and brushed past me, leaving me seething in the cluttered trailer. I gazed one more time at the scale model of the vile complex they intended to erect. A pang of helpless rage stabbed at my gut. But then, the corner of my mouth twitched. Miss Hoa had no clue who she was up against. I slammed the trailer door behind me and walked back to the farmhouse, ignoring the curious stares from the construction crew. Once inside, I yanked open a metal filing cabinet in my study. The orchard deed had to be in there somewhere. After 5 minutes of flipping through dusty files, I found it. A yellowed piece of parchment from decades ago, naming me as the official inheritor of the orchard land. At the bottom, my father's handwritten signature shimmered faintly against the old ink. In any court of law, it would stand as proof of rightful ownership. The only question, why had the county labeled it abandoned? A swirl of frustration built in my chest. I realized that if Miss Hoa had convinced local officials I'd defaulted, that spelled corruption at a deeper level. Maybe someone in the county clerk's office had been bribed or leaned on to expedite her claims. My father's orchard was prime real estate, nestled conveniently near the wetlands. The environmental aspect might also be an obstacle for her, but obviously she was plowing ahead. The only reason she would do that was if she had cover from someone with authority in local government. If that was the case, this entire situation was bigger than a single orchard. Part of me wanted to storm City Hall, fling the deed in the mayor's face, and shout that the entire development was illegal. But a more calculated part of me advised caution. If I allowed Miss Hoa to see my full hand too early, she'd have time to bury her tracks or spin public opinion. Let her believe that she was the apex predator. Let her think all I had were empty threats. I decided the best way was to gather evidence quietly, document every illicit step Ms. Hoa took, find out which officials she had in her pocket. Then, I would bring this into a venue she couldn't manipulate. And ironically enough, that venue might just be my own courtroom. But I needed to recuse myself if it came to that. Still, as someone intimately familiar with this system, I knew how to set off the chain reaction: an injunction, a petition to question the validity of a property reassignment, a call for the city to open an official probe into suspicious activity, and if any of that failed, I had the power to appoint a special hearing in front of a visiting judge from the district. I had connections, I had leverage, and I had the truth on my side. I spent the rest of that sweltering afternoon hauled up in my study, combing through county records online, sending discreet emails to contacts in the municipal building, and cross-checking property tax documents. My objective was to trace the orchard's tax history and see exactly how it ended up classified as unclaimed farmland. By early evening, I had a suspicious puzzle piece. The orchard's tax bills, it seemed, had been redirected from my father's old P.O. box to an unknown address in the city 2 years ago, all because of a single change of address form that had been filed. My father had been dead for 7 years. Who filed that form? I printed copies of everything and placed them in a binder. Then, as twilight fell, I looked out the window to see the crew winding down for the day. The orchard was nearly flattened, a heartbreakingly barren stretch of land under the fading orange sky. I wanted to tear out my hair with frustration, but instead, I recalled the countless times criminals in my courtroom had thought they were above the law, only to have me lay down a verdict that made them regret their arrogance. Ms. Hoa would soon discover the meaning of real accountability. The following morning, I was awakened by a distant crackle of a loudspeaker. Peering out, I realized Ms. Hoa and a local councilman named Riley were addressing a small group of city officials near the orchard. They were holding a so-called progress ceremony. A wave of fury tightened my chest. They were celebrating my orchard's destruction as if it were a victory for the town. My phone vibrated on the bedside table. Jesse again, sending me a link to a social media video that was live streaming the event. I tapped the link. Sure enough, Ms. Hoa was on camera extolling the virtues of her new development. She smiled brightly for the camera, praising the city's efforts to reclaim unused land for a more prosperous future. A few local reporters hovered on the periphery, scribbling in notepads or filming with phones. I decided I needed to be there too, but I didn't want to make a scene just yet. Instead, I threw on a ball cap and an old jacket, walked over, and lingered behind the crowd. Ms. Hoa's voice carried through the loudspeaker with a commanding edge. This project will bring in millions of dollars of revenue, create jobs, and provide modern amenities. We're revitalizing Bloomfield, turning it into a place of opportunity. This orchard, unfortunately, had been neglected for years. It's no secret that farmland can't pay the bills when left untended. We're stepping up to fill that void. The local councilman nodded approvingly, patting Ms. Hoa on the shoulder. And rest assured, he chimed in, our city planning committee thoroughly reviewed every environmental regulation to ensure the wetlands remain unharmed. He let out a practiced chuckle. We want progress that respects our beloved environment. I nearly choked. Their hypocrisy was almost laughable. The orchard wasn't neglected. It had just been overshadowed by a mistake in the deed transfer and manipulated by those who knew how to exploit it. A few townspeople stood in the crowd, clapping politely, probably enticed by the promise of job openings or cheap property taxes. No one asked the tough questions. No one pointed out that farmland might not pay the same immediate bills as a shopping plaza, but it sure did sustain a sense of heritage and environmental balance for the community. I felt Jesse's hand on my shoulder. He had spotted me. Hey, he whispered. They're spouting nonsense. That plan will devastate the wetlands with runoff pollution no matter what they claim. I've seen the drainage designs. They're minimal at best. I clenched my jaw. We'll stop them, I murmured. Trust me. But as Ms. Ho continued to speak, I realized she had the flair of a politician. She switched smoothly between praising the local culture and promising economic progress, sprinkling in a dash of fear-mongering, warning the crowd that if we don't adapt, our town will be left behind. It was an effective pitch for those eager for growth. I overheard an elderly man behind me whisper something about how excited he was for the possibility of a new pharmacy and grocery store within walking distance. My heart sank. They genuinely believed Miss Hoa was a hero. I waited until Miss Hoa's speech ended and the crowd started to disperse. Then I saw her exchanging pleasantries with the councilman, both wearing smug grins. I decided to approach them calmly. I wanted to rattle Miss Hoa's cage just a bit, but not blow my cover entirely. Councilman Riley, I said, tipping my ball cap. Afternoon. He eyed me warily. Good afternoon, sir. Have we met? No, I replied, but I'm Graham Anderson, the actual owner of this orchard you just bulldozed. Ms. Hoa narrowed her eyes, but maintained a neutral posture. Ah, Mr. Anderson, good to see you again so soon. You might have missed the details of our development agreement, but I've seen enough details, I said icily. Councilman, you do realize this orchard wasn't actually abandoned, right? I have the deed, and any taxes owed were part of a bureaucratic error that I have every intention of correcting. He cleared his throat. Well, Mr. Anderson, the city's position is that this land was forfeited due to unpaid taxes. It was up for reassignment, and the HOA placed a valid claim. I'm sorry for your confusion, but the matter is settled. Unless Ms. Hoa added, her tone dripping with condescension. You want to contest it in court. But that would be a long, expensive process. And in the meantime, we'd continue building. I suspect you wouldn't get anywhere, given the documentation. My advice is to accept our standard compensation package. We're fair. We can offer a nominal settlement for your trouble. The councilman nodded agreement. Yes, Mr. Anderson, that might be best, for everyone. I studied their faces for a moment. Miss Hoa's eyes glinted with the cunning of someone used to winning. She had no clue I was a sitting judge with a reputation for exposing shady officials. No idea that her plan to steamroll me wouldn't be so easy. I forced a polite smile. I'll take your suggestion under advisement, I said. But I assure you, Miss Hoa, this is... As I turned away, I spotted a local reporter scribbling in her notepad. She glanced up, probably overhearing bits of our conversation. Our eyes met briefly. There was curiosity in her gaze. My intuition told me she might be looking for a scoop. I made a mental note to approach her later, to feed her the story in a way that would unravel Miss Hoa's propaganda from the inside out. By noon, the sun hammered the orchard mercilessly, and the crowd had mostly dispersed. The construction crew rumbled back to life. The beep-beep of reversing trucks echoed across the field. I decided that, before taking any formal legal action, I'd do something simpler, gather more community support. Miss Hoa might have some bigwigs on her side, but Bloomfield was still a small town at heart. If I could open people's eyes to the fact that Miss Hoa was pulling strings and possibly harming the wetlands in the process, I'd have an army of residents on my side. I connected with Jesse again, and we decided to organize a meeting at a local diner that evening. He invited several neighbors who were on the fence about the plaza. One of them was Lydia Marshall, a single mother who had been trying to keep her modest homestead afloat while facing constant compliance fines from Ms. Hoa's association. Another was Robert Garza, a retired teacher living on a fixed income, who said Ms. Hoa had threatened to increase his HOA fees if he didn't paint his house a certain color. And then there was Hannah Parker, who owned a produce stand near the orchard and worried she'd lose her livelihood if the new plaza overshadowed local farmers. When we gathered at the diner, the mood was tense. We all shared stories of Ms. Hoa's bullying tactics, how she'd allegedly used her connections in City Hall to push small landowners into selling or complying with arbitrary rules. Lydia recounted with tears in her eyes how her mailbox had been cited for being too close to the curb, resulting in a hefty fine. She suspected Ms. Hoa was using every trick to force her out so that the HOA could buy her land on the cheap. Robert spoke of a quietly menacing phone call he received after he tried to speak up at a community meeting. A gruff voice warned him that if he continued spreading negativity, he might find the cost of his water bills skyrocketing. For a man on a pension, that was no idle threat. Hannah lamented that every time she tried to host a local produce fair, Miss Hoa's office would suddenly declare a new permit requirement that was expensive and time-consuming. As I listened, my rage simmered again. Miss Hoa's tyranny spread far beyond my orchard. How many families had already buckled under her pressure? How many times had she gotten away with it because no one had the power or the nerve to stand against her in the legal arena? All right, folks, I said, resting my elbows on the laminate table. I've been on the receiving end of her manipulation too, but we need evidence to expose her. Stories are powerful, but documents, emails, letters, those form the backbone of a case. Is anyone here willing to let me see the notices or fines or any correspondence from the HOA? They all nodded eagerly. Lydia even had a folder stuffed with violation notices, each with Ms. Hoa's signature at the bottom. Robert had a few letters from the city's finance department referencing sudden changes in his property tax assessment, presumably orchestrated by Ms. Hoa's connections. Hannah had newspaper clippings about the strange permit requirements. I gathered everything, scanning them with a small portable scanner I'd brought along. Then we made digital copies so nothing could mysteriously disappear from their homes. Before leaving, I gave them each a reassuring smile. I can't share everything yet, but I promise you, I'm working on a strategy to fight this. Don't let Ms. Hoa's intimidation get to you. The law, when properly applied, is on our side. Thank you, Lydia whispered, tears shining in her eyes. We've felt alone in this for too long. Jessie handed me a slip of paper with the name of a local journalist, Sandra Wu, who had once tried to investigate Ms. Hoa's dealings. She got close to publishing something, but the piece was pulled at the last minute, he explained. Word on the street says Ms. Hoa's people threatened to sue the newspaper for defamation if they ran the story. I tucked the note in my pocket. I might reach out to her, see if she'll pick up where she left off. That night I holed up in the farmhouse, combing through the new documents. They painted a grim mosaic of corruption, fines that had no legal basis, conveniently changed zoning regulations, suspicious property reclassifications, all bearing Ms. Hoa's fingerprints. By the time the grandfather clock struck midnight, I had a headache from the weight of it all. But I also had a plan. The next morning I arrived at the Bloomfield County Courthouse bright and early. I was scheduled to preside over an unrelated civil case that day, but I had a bigger agenda in mind. Upon stepping into my chambers, I locked the door, pulled out the orchard deed, and typed up a formal petition for an injunction against Garrick and Lewis developers and the Bloomfield HOA. In it, I laid out the grounds for fraud, misrepresentation of property ownership, and potential environmental violations. I also requested a temporary halt to all construction until a thorough investigation could take place. However, I knew that as the presiding judge, I couldn't sign this order myself. It would be a blatant conflict of interest. So I reached out to a friend, Judge Karen Hamilton, who served in the next county but occasionally took special cases in ours. I explained the situation in broad strokes, emphasizing that I had undeniable evidence Ms. Hoa's group was acting illegally. She agreed to review the petition as soon as I filed it in the clerk's office. An hour later, I stood before the county clerk, waiting in line behind a bored-looking attorney carrying a stack of real estate files. When my turn came, I quietly handed over the petition, along with the evidence binder. The clerk, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, glanced at the documents, then up at me with obvious surprise. He knew me as the local judge, but I merely nodded, and he accepted the filing. I could see the curiosity shining in his gaze. As I exited the clerk's office, I bumped into Ms. Hoa. She seemed just as startled to see me in the courthouse. Perhaps she was there to finalize some permit or meet with the same city officials she had in her pocket. Her eyebrows rose. "Mr. Anderson, fancy seeing you here. Are you sure you want to be on these grounds? After all, you're not a lawyer, right?" She smirked, obviously poking at the fact that I wasn't known locally as an attorney. She had no idea I had a seat on the very bench she walked beneath. "I'm sure," I replied calmly, refusing to divulge anything. I noticed she held a thick folder labeled City Budget Proposals. A thought flicked through my mind. She's probably ensuring the budget for her plaza was guaranteed. She brushed past me, perfume lingering in the air. I watched her go, a steely determination in my veins. If all went according to plan, by the time her boot heels clicked out of the building, she'd be served with my injunction notice. And that's precisely what happened. Late that afternoon, Ms. Hoa's bulldozers ground to a confused halt. Workers milled about, checking their phones, uncertain why they'd received instructions to cease activity. A short while later, Ms. Hoa arrived on site, fuming as she waved a legal paper in the air. Her face was livid with anger, and she snapped at the foreman. "Find out who the hell filed this injunction. We were told no one could stop us." From a discreet distance, I watched the scene unfold. She had discovered the first of many nasty surprises I had in store. The best part, the injunction was signed by Judge Hamilton, so Ms. Hoa couldn't directly accuse me of meddling in my own case. I stayed out of sight, not wanting to gloat. It was time to lie low. I needed Ms. Hoa to keep believing I was just an ordinary landowner who'd somehow found a sympathetic judge. Meanwhile, I had a few more cards up my sleeve. Namely, the documents Lydia and the others had given me, which outlined Ms. Hoa's pattern of intimidation. And then there was the environmental angle. Ms. Hoa had likely cut corners in the environmental impact assessment, especially concerning the wetlands. If I could prove that, it would be a crippling blow to her credibility. No politician in a small American town wants to be labeled the destroyer of protected wetlands. That alone could sink her project faster than any personal property dispute. The next day, I arranged a meeting with an old colleague named Dr. Bowman, an environmental scientist who occasionally consulted for the state. We met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Bowman was a tall, wiry man with salt and pepper hair and gentle eyes. He listened intently as I described the orchard's proximity to the wetlands, and my suspicion that Ms. HOA's engineering plans disregarded the possibility of toxic runoff or flooding. He tapped his chin thoughtfully. If they're building a large commercial plaza, they'll need substantial drainage systems, retention ponds, the whole works, Bowman said, sipping his coffee. If they skip any step or fudge the data in the environmental report, that's a violation. Provided the wetlands are recognized under state or federal protection, Ms. HOA could face major legal repercussions. I have a copy of the environmental report they submitted, I said, sliding it across the table. Jesse had managed to snag a copy from a city records request. Bowman flipped through it, his frown deepening by the page. "This is incomplete," he muttered. "They mention tests, but they don't include the actual data. They also ignore the effect of large-scale paving on local water tables." He closed the report and looked up at me. "There's enough here to warrant a deeper investigation. If I can get a sample analysis of the soil and water near the orchard, I might be able to prove the risk is real." I nodded, grateful for his expertise. "Then let's do it. Anything you need. We'll gather the data and show the courts Ms. HOA's ignoring environmental hazards." We arranged for Dr. Bowman to visit the orchard the following weekend, stealthily collecting soil and water samples from the wetlands area just beyond the orchard's boundary. His lab tests would either confirm or deny the potential harm. If confirmed, it would be a major piece of ammunition to keep Ms. HOA's bulldozers away permanently. In the meantime, Monsieur was not idle. A day after the injunction halted her construction, she filed a counter-motion in court, claiming I was unjustly obstructing a lawful development and demanded the injunction be lifted immediately. Judge Hamilton scheduled a preliminary hearing to determine whether the injunction should remain in place. Finally, a direct confrontation loomed, one where I could present the orchard deed, the suspicious change of address forms, and the environmental concerns. It would be Ms. HOA's first time facing me in a courtroom setting. The day of the preliminary hearing, the old courthouse bustled with energy. Reporters milled about, townspeople crammed the pews, and Ms. HOA stood with her high-priced attorney at one table. I took the other side, representing myself, though I wore no judicial robe, of course. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lydia, Robert, Hannah, and Jesse sitting in the back row, anxiety written all over their faces. Judge Hamilton, a stern woman with a pragmatic gaze, banged her gavel lightly to call the hearing to order. She addressed Ms. HOA's attorney first. "Counselor, your client insists this development is legal?" A well-groomed man in an expensive suit stepped forward, smoothing his tie. "Yes, Your Honor. My client was granted rights to the orchard via standard municipal procedures after Mr. Anderson failed to pay taxes and neglected to appear at the relevant hearing. This is a legitimate business venture that the city has fully approved. The injunction is causing significant financial harm to the project." Judge Hamilton nodded coolly, then turned to me. "Mr. Anderson, you claim you never received proper notice of the hearing and that your orchard was illegally reassigned?" I rose, clearing my throat. The tension in the room felt electric. "Yes, Your Honor, I have in my possession the original deed, along with evidence that the orchard was never truly abandoned. The non-payment of taxes was due to a clerical error fueled by a fraudulent change of address. I also have letters from local residents indicating Ms. HOA's association commonly uses intimidation and questionable tactics to seize land. Furthermore, an environmental report has glaring omissions, which could endanger a nearby protected wetland." Ms. HOA's attorney scoffed. "Objection. This hearing is solely about the property claim, not environmental concerns. Mr. Anderson is conflating unrelated matters in an attempt to stall a legitimate project." Judge Hamilton raised a hand. "Overruled, Counselor. The environment and the property claim are connected if there's suspicion of falsified or incomplete data used to justify the development. Mr. Anderson, please continue." I nodded gratefully. I've asked for an independent environmental analysis to be conducted. If it confirms that the wetlands are at risk, then Ms. Hoa's entire construction approval might be invalid. That's because the city's permit was contingent on them adhering to the environmental regulations. Ms. Hoa herself couldn't remain silent. She stood, ignoring her lawyer's attempt to restrain her. "Your Honor," she said in a frosty tone, "I see no reason to credit these outlandish claims from a man who, frankly, missed his chance to object weeks ago. We followed the law. We have letters from the city council supporting our project. Mr. Anderson is simply bitter and trying to sabotage progress in this town." Judge Hamilton fixed her with a measured gaze. "Ms. Hoa, I advise you to let your attorney speak on your behalf unless called to testify. For now, I will leave the injunction in place until I can review Mr. Anderson's evidence. I intend to schedule a formal hearing next week where we can present all documents and call witnesses. If Mr. Anderson proves fraud or environmental dangers, the city's approval may be revoked." The gavel struck again and a low murmur spread through the courtroom. Ms. Hoa's face darkened with fury, but she remained silent, likely receiving a discreet gesture from her attorney to keep quiet. I fought the urge to smile. It was a small victory, but a critical one. The construction stayed frozen for at least another week. I could see Lydia and the others exchanging relieved glances. Ms. Hoa, though, had the glint of revenge in her eyes, as if she was already planning her next move. Outside the courtroom, reporters clamored for quotes. Ms. Hoy's attorney shielded her from questions, but a few turned microphones toward me. I kept my answers succinct, stating that the orchard was my rightful inheritance and that I believed justice would prevail. I spotted the local reporter I'd seen earlier at the orchard, scribbling in her notebook. Then a woman with a camera approached, identifying herself as Sandra Wu, the very journalist Jesse had mentioned. "Mr. Anderson," she said, pushing her microphone toward me, "can you elaborate on the environmental risks? Are you suggesting Ms. Hoa knew about potential threats to the wetlands but proceeded anyway?" I gazed into the camera lens, measuring my words. "I'm suggesting there's enough evidence to raise serious questions. Our environment is precious. I encourage Ms. Hoa and her team to do a thorough review if they truly care about the community." Sandra nodded. "What about allegations that Ms. Hoa intimidates residents? Some say the HOA fines are unfair, that property owners are harassed. Have you seen any proof?" I paused, thinking of Lydia's thick folder. But I couldn't release everything to the media just yet. "I can't discuss the specifics, but I will say I've seen alarming documents that warrant an official investigation. This hearing is just the beginning." Sandra thanked me and turned off the camera, her eyes shining with the thrill of a journalist onto a big story. Off the record, she whispered, "I tried to expose Miss Hoa once, but it got shut down. I'm glad someone's finally challenging her on record." I nodded. "Keep digging," I told her. Before I slipped away into the bustling corridor, I felt a surge of hope tempered by caution. Miss Hoa was dangerous, well-connected, and cunning. But now the fight was out in the open. The more scrutiny she faced, the less she could rely on backroom deals. That evening, I holed up in the farmhouse once again, sorting through a new wave of tips from residents emboldened by the day's events. They sent me emails describing Ms. Hoa's ruthless tactics, from forging signatures to colluding with city tax officials. The more I read, the more I realized Ms. Hoa was the linchpin of a grand scheme. She didn't just want a single shopping plaza, she wanted to systematically take over valuable land across the county and mold the town into her personal empire. A knock on my door startled me. When I opened it, I found Miss Hoa standing there, alone under the dim porch light. She wore a tailored suit that seemed absurdly formal for a nighttime visit in rural Bloomfield. Her expression was a twisted blend of anger and forced cordiality. "May I come in?" she asked, her tone clipped. I considered refusing, but part of me was curious about what she'd say face to face. "Fine," I said, stepping aside. She entered, glancing around at the old wooden floors and cozy living room. I led her to a chair and I remained standing, arms crossed. "What do you want?" She sighed dramatically. Mr. Anderson, let's be civilized. I'm here to propose a settlement, one that doesn't involve dragging this out in court. No matter what you believe about me, I don't enjoy conflict. I prefer mutually beneficial solutions. I pursed my lips. Mutually beneficial or beneficial to you? Because from where I stand, you stole my orchard through deceitful means and tried to flatten it before I could fight back. Her chin lifted. A development like this brings real economic growth. But if your orchard is that dear to you, I might be able to persuade the city to restore your ownership. On paper, at least. In exchange, you'll sell me a portion of the land at a fair price. We'll carve out a compromise that allows the plaza to move forward. My eyes narrowed. I couldn't believe her audacity. So you want me to remain the nominal owner while handing control to you behind the scenes? Why? She gave a thin smile. Because this fiasco is attracting too much attention. The environmental complaints alone could kill the project if the press runs wild. I'd rather tie this up neatly. You keep a portion of the orchard, enough to satisfy your sentimental attachment, and the rest becomes a profitable center for the entire town. You'd come out of it with a handsome payment. Everyone wins. I stared at her, my heart drumming. Was this real? Or just a last-ditch effort to lure me into dropping the lawsuit? And if I don't agree? I asked, voice low. Her gaze hardened. Then you'll face a legal barrage you can't possibly match. My attorneys will drown you in motions, appeals, and legal costs. We'll smear you in the media. By the time we're done, you'll be begging for a settlement. If you think the injunction is your big triumph, let me remind you, that's temporary. Eventually, a court could dismiss your claims. You'll be left with nothing but debt from the legal fees. I let her words hang in the air. Inside, I felt a cold fury. She truly believed I was some powerless rube. I inhaled slowly, trying to quell the desire to laugh in her face. Instead, I leaned in, letting a bit of my own conviction bleed through. Ms. HOA, I said, with measured calm, I've lived on this land my entire life. My father died here. I'll fight for it until my last breath. And I'm not afraid of your legal barrage. Take your settlement offer and walk out that door. Her nostrils flared. She looked ready to unleash a tirade, but something in my voice made her hesitate. After a tense silence, she stood abruptly and brushed imaginary dust off her immaculate blazer. Fine, she muttered. Remember this conversation, Mr. Anderson, when the legal storm hits you and you have no one to blame but yourself? She stomped out of the house, slamming the screen door behind her. I exhaled a shaky breath, adrenaline coursing through my veins. A part of me recognized the risk. She was powerful, and no doubt she'd make good on some of her threats. But I also knew that once Miss HOA discovered who she was really up against, the game would change entirely. The next week flew by in a whirlwind. Dr. Bowman returned with preliminary data showing that the water near the orchard already had elevated levels of contaminants from the partial construction. If the plaza was completed without proper safeguards, the wetlands could suffer irreversible damage. Meanwhile, Lydia found older emails referencing Ms. HOA's attempts to hide negative environmental impact statements. I forwarded all this to Judge Hamilton, who was building the docket for the formal hearing. When hearing day arrived, the courthouse was packed. Word had spread that the future of Miss HOA's shopping plaza, and quite possibly the future of local politics, was at stake. The hearing room buzzed with anticipation as Miss HOA's legal team tried to discredit my evidence, claiming Dr. Bowman's credentials were overstated and the contamination data was inconclusive. But then, I played an audio recording Lydia had taken from a prior HOA meeting where Ms. HOA had admitted to skipping certain environmental steps because they would be too expensive and time-consuming. The hush that fell over the courtroom was palpable. Judge Hamilton fixed Ms. HOA with a piercing stare. Ms. HOA, is this your voice on the recording? Ms. HOA's cheeks blanched. She fumbled for a plausible denial but failed to produce one. Her attorney stammered about context and misleading snippets, but the damage was done. The judge's gaze then turned to the city's representative, who'd shown up to defend the original permit. And you, sir, why did the city fail to insist on a full environmental assessment? He squirmed, eventually muttering about budget constraints and how Ms. Hoa had presented the project as having minimal impact. It was clear Ms. Hoa had bought or bullied her way through official channels, leaving the city with egg on its face. The judge took notes, her frown deepening with each revelation. Finally, it was time to address the property rights question. I produced my orchard deed and the chain of evidence showing the fraudulent change of address. The city clerk testified that her office never approved any official change, indicating Ms. Ho's people had forged the documentation to make the orchard appear abandoned. Ms. Ho's attorney tried desperately to shift blame onto rogue employees, but that flimsy excuse only made things worse. Near the conclusion of the hearing, Ms. Hoa, with a last-ditch attempt at bravado, glared at me from across the courtroom. "You can't stop this project forever, Mr. Anderson. I have influential backers, and they won't let you sabotage progress in Bloomfield." I caught her gaze, and in that moment I allowed a flicker of my true identity to surface in my demeanor. "Ms. Hoa," I said calmly, "I'm all for progress, legitimate, lawful progress, but what you've done to me and to others in this community is anything but lawful." She snorted. "What do you know of the law, orchard man?" A hush fell, the corners of my mouth twitched, I slowly lifted my chin. "More than you might imagine," I said, letting the words drip with significance. Then Judge Hamilton cleared her throat, calling the room to attention. "I've heard enough," she declared. "The evidence of fraudulent means to claim the orchard is compelling. The environmental concerns are equally troubling. I'm extending the injunction indefinitely and ordering a full investigation into the Bloomfield HOA's practices, as well as this so-called development project. Furthermore, I'm restoring the orchard property to Mr. Anderson's rightful ownership pending verification of tax payments, which, given the evidence, seems likely to be resolved promptly in his favor." A roar of relief and applause broke out from the gallery. Ms. Hoa's face turned scarlet with indignation. She began to protest, but the judge banged her gavel again. "I warn you, Ms. Hoa," the judge intoned. "Any further outburst will be held in contempt." Ms. Ho's attorney roughly tugged her arm, pulling her back. The judge then concluded, "Court is adjourned." The crowd erupted with excitement. Lydia, Robert, Hannah, Jesse, they all swarmed me, offering hugs and handshakes. I saw Ms. Hoa storm out in a huff, refusing to speak to reporters. Her empire of intimidation had been dealt a serious blow, though I suspected she wouldn't vanish quietly. In the days that followed, a county task force launched an official probe. Meanwhile, Ms. Ho's name splashed across local headlines tied to allegations of bribery, forgery, and environmental violations. Several local officials, including Councilman Riley, faced censure and possible criminal charges for aiding her scheme. Shortly after, Ms. Hoa tried to mount a public relations campaign, portraying herself as a victim of political sabotage. But by then, too many residents had come forward with evidence of her harassment. Even the mayor distanced himself, feigning ignorance. Eventually, Ms. Hoa received a cease and desist from the state attorney general's office, halting any further developments she was involved in. Rumors flew that Ms. Hoa's real estate business was crumbling under the weight of lawsuits and investigations. I never did reveal publicly that I was Judge Graham Anderson, the strictest judge in the county court, at least not until Ms. Hoa's lawyers tried to challenge the legality of the hearing under some twisted logic. They argued that I, as a judge, had orchestrated everything behind the scenes. But when that motion reached my courtroom, I gracefully recused myself, and another district judge upheld every single ruling Judge Hamilton had made. In the end, Ms. Hoa's underhanded tactics had come to light, and the orchard and the wetlands remained safe. The orchard itself lay in ruins from the partial construction, but I hired local workers to replant trees and restore the land as best as we could. It would take years for the orchard to look like it once did, but the soil was still fertile. Nature has a way of healing if given the chance. So does a community. The neighbors and townspeople who had once been timid under Ms. Hoa's reign found their voices. They organized new associations free from corruption, ones that genuinely cared about preserving Bloomfield's heritage, while still pursuing thoughtful growth. One crisp autumn afternoon, I stood at the edge of the orchard, gazing at rows of new saplings stretching under the golden sun. A gentle breeze carried the scent of earth and promise. In the distance, I heard a few voices, local families who had come to volunteer their time, helping plant and water the young trees. This orchard was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who had fought for justice and refused to let greed prevail. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, recalling how the orchard had once symbolized my father's dream of a simpler, honest life. It still did. Only now, it also stood for the resilience of a community that refused to be bullied. Ms. HOA had set out to build a shopping plaza, but what she built, instead, was a unified neighborhood, rallying to protect what mattered most: our land, our people, our heritage. And in the midst of it all, she had unwittingly picked a fight with the one man in Bloomfield she never should have underestimated. As dusk rolled in, painting the sky in lavender and pink, I ran my fingers over the budding leaves of a newly planted apple tree. My father's voice echoed in my memory, reminding me that good soil, when tended with care, can yield wonders. We had weathered the storm of corruption and greed. We had exposed conspiracies and forced the powerful to answer for their crimes. And for the orchard, at least, a new day was dawning, unburdened by the shadows Ms. Ho had tried to cast. It stood as a testament to the power of resilience and the unyielding pursuit of justice. I smiled, lifting my gaze to the horizon. The farmland stretched before me like a promise, the gentle hush of wind through the saplings telling me the fight had been worth it. This land was and would always remain the heart of my family and the heart of Bloomfield's spirit. Nothing, not even the might of a corrupt homeowners association, could bulldoze that truth away, and that, I reflected with a peaceful sense of finality, was a victory worth every ounce of struggle. Thank you for listening and sharing this journey. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to pass it along to others who might need that spark of hope. Sometimes standing up to injustice in your own backyard can echo through an entire community. You never know what seeds of change you might plant in the process.